Hello, I'm Dr. Suzanne Fish. I'm being interviewed at my home in Tucson, Arizona on March 8th, 2019. I'm Curator Emeritus from the Arizona State Museum, and I'm also Professor Emeritus from the School of Anthropology at the University of Arizona. I got into archaeology by reading a child's magazine called Jack and Jill when I was 6 years old, and it had a story about Schliemann and Troy. And I thought it was fascinating, and what I really liked about it was there was a photograph of Schliemann's wife wearing all the gold jewelry from Troy. And I really like jewelry, and I decided, archaeology had lots of facets that I hadn't even thought of. Until I got to college, I was kind of a voracious reader, and I can remember going to the library and just going through the shelves and reading things about archaeology that I could find. I think, most people think they're going to be an Egyptologist. I probably entertained something romantic like that. And I didn't really have a focus, and I never had any practical experience until I was an undergraduate. But I declared that as my major. I didn't choose the institution I attended based on its archaeological reputation. I went to Rice University, which is, a STEM university, and but it did have a good small anthropology department, and I pursued that. And by the time I was finishing my undergraduate degree, I had gone to a field school in Washington State, and then Frank Hole, who was the major professor at Rice, asked me if I wanted to work in Oaxaca with a University of Michigan project, which I did, and that opened my eyes to everything archaeology could be. And it also kind of gave me an interest in Neolithic level developments, and made me think about environmental issues. So I combined those things throughout the rest of my career. I have had a number of research foci. In fact, my Ph.D. is in an interdisciplinary program. It's called Arid Lands Resource Sciences. And for instance, on my committee, I had 2 archaeologists, 2 geographers, and a biologist and geoscientist. So my background is kind of varied and multidisciplinary. So I have always combined archaeology per se with an interest in environmental kinds of studies. And in fact, my education emphasized that combination as well. I've worked in Highland, Mexico for a number of years as a graduate student. Well, my first real interest, developed interest in archaeology was in the formative period in Highland, Mexico. And I was not in charge of that, but as a graduate student, I worked in many aspects, including palynology, which is one of my specialties, and then just excavation and trying to interpret and learning from others how to interpret. Kent Flannery was in charge of that project, and he was an excellent teacher. And there are many other people who came and visited or were part of the staff, and it was a wonderful learning experience. And I became very interested in sort of Neolithic level, traditional agriculture, irrigators, interests that I've followed the rest of my life. Then I've also worked in Georgia, in the southeast with sort of Neolithic level mound builders, just as in Highland, Mexico. And then I have worked in the Southwest with the Hohokam and sort of Neolithic level mound builders. And so it's kind of a thread that's gone through my archaeological research, watching how these different areas developed in different ways. Another research focus regionally has been Northwest Mexico, in the area of Northwest Sonora. And then for something totally different, I've worked for many years in coastal Brazil with show mounds. My first specialty was being a palynologist and doing many, many analyses at many sites, which was exciting and eye-opening. In my later career, I've gravitated much more toward a more holistic archaeological orientation, and finally really enjoyed designing my own research and being part of the design of projects that were multi-year. When I was mainly doing palynological consulting work, I worked on a project here in Arizona called the Salt Gila project. And I think that was really an eye-opening experience for me. I had wonderful colleagues, Chris Suter and Charles Mixacek, and the three of us began to think about the Hohokam environment as a highly modified one, that it was not a natural environment by any means, and each of us had a different way of looking at how it was a human modified environment. And I think that was kind of a very exciting time in Hohokam environmental studies. And we managed to cooperate very nicely in looking at that together. I had two major positions with the SAA. I was an editor of Latin American antiquity for a term, and I think that came about because I had worked in Mexico and Brazil and knew a fair number of Latin American archaeologists and the literature, and that was very stressful and very rewarding. I think I learned so much from doing that, and I had a co-editor who was a Brazilian friend. And then the second major involvement was as a member of the board, a member at large of the board for a term as well. I have been a regular attendee at the lecture series of the Archaeological and Historical Society. I think it's a great service to people who live in Tucson and even further away. Helps keep me current with Southwestern Archaeology and History. I've also served on the awards committee for a number of years and as a member of the nominating committee more recently. I have a very odd career in that I have done my research with my husband Paul Fish for maybe 40 years now. We somehow have a professional relationship that has made that work. It's been very productive for us. We bounce ideas off each other. We argue a lot, but we both bring a different knowledge set, and I think we eventually come to some consensus on what we're doing, and it's worked very well for us. We were very interested early on in working with Hohokam studies in what we call full coverage survey of the Hohokam area. And we worked for 6 years assembling a settlement pattern with many, many students in the northern Tucson Basin, and actually produced a data set that I think is fairly unique in Southwestern archaeology. We had community patterns surrounding platform mounds, and of course the earlier part of the sequence as well. And I think that is one of our greatest benefits to Hohokam archaeology in producing that kind of settlement pattern. I think it definitely for us turned our focus away from individual sites and began to realize that these conglomerations of associated sites that we were looking at were the the primary social and political unit, that we could look at individual sites, but if we did so, we lost a lot of information and understanding without looking at that whole set of sites that was associated together on a regular, continuing basis. So full coverage survey, large-scale survey. We also did a more modest survey of that sort around the site of Cerro de Trincheras in Sonora. And I think, that again gained a kind of understanding that you can't get from excavations alone or from focusing on a couple of sites. And from there, we became interested in trincheras sites, the hill sites that have different assortments of rock features. Some are residential, some are not. And from there, that interest developed into work at Tumamoc Hill in the Tucson Basin. At a very early time period, we had emphasized sort of the time of the Hohokam Classic period, about AD 1200 to 1450 or later. And Tumamoc Hill was quite different in that it had an early agricultural and early ceramic village component at the top. Starting with the really extended survey we did in the Tucson area, Paul and I became very interested in what we call the Marana Community, which is a platform mound that was preserved in its site, that was preserved in its entirety in a way that very few are. It had never been disturbed or plowed. It was a wonderful opportunity, and we combined that interest and extended excavations there with our real enthusiasm for working with students. On the survey, we had employed probably a total of 200 students over the 6 years that we continued working on it. And so thereafter, almost everything we did involved a field school. And we had wonderful graduate assistants whose names you would recognize now as people who are very active in Southwest and other archaeological areas. But we also had a continuing set of undergraduates who were often having their first experience and deciding if they wanted to be archaeologists in the field schools. And it was a lot of work, but it was really a joy to work with these students and sort of see how they began to get involved. So from beginning to end, really since 1980, we have taught field schools at the University of Arizona. Actually, we had one from the University of Georgia in the Verde Valley to start out with when we first moved back to Tucson after being there. So that is a thread that's run through my career completely. And then we had the great fortune to work in Brazil, which was in the southern hemisphere, and having winter when it was summer in Tucson. And it was the perfect time to be somewhere else. But it was a wonderful opportunity, too, to do something so different and think about other problems. And we had ongoing Brazilian colleagues that we really formed a bond with, and have just this year given probably our last paper with them on the Brazilian work. And we worked with these giant shell mounds that accreted over sometimes a couple of thousand years and were completely full of burials. And because we were able to map huge profiles in these shell mounds, because they had been mined for shell, for road beds and concrete, all sorts of uses, there were these great cavities in them, and we could just clean up those cavities and map them and show very conclusively that they were actually burial mounds. And they had grown through time as people were buried there by social groups, different social groups, even sometimes contemporary ones, and then covered with shell, and then the process would start all over again until they were up to, say, 30 meters high. The one that we worked on the most was only about 10 meters high, but we're talking about shell mounds the size of football fields and quite large. And that was really exciting, and I think, again, our Brazilian colleagues and we thought we had made a real contribution to actually documenting without any doubt that these were mortuary features. In general, I think my career has had a sort of strange trajectory. I didn't go through undergraduate and graduate school without pauses. I think largely because, among other things, I was a woman and I wanted a family, and certainly that took a little more time to finish. There were times when I made my living not as regular employment through a university or a company, but as a consultant doing pollen analysis. I did become employed at a regular job, which was great, and it involved students and work in a museum. So it was, I've been so fortunate in those kinds of things. And at the end of my career, I was employed in both places at the University of Arizona, did teaching, which I enjoyed very much, had field schools, and finally followed up on an early classic platform mound with work at a late classic platform mound and settlement that gave us really a great developmental trajectory, always with field schools. We mentioned before that Paul and I worked at the Marana Community, and we were able to sample across it. It is such a large settlement, about a mile in its longest diameter, and so well preserved that we had a sampling strategy. First, we sampled the surface, then sampled trash mounds, which was Jim Bayman's dissertation, and then sampled rooms in compounds. It was a very large site. It only lasted about 100 years, and it may well have been the first try of local people at having a platform mound in the middle of a central settlement and a very large concentration of people for this area in that time. We estimate 800 to 1,000 people in 42 different compounds. As we've worked more with this very large site, we have realized that there were more compounds there. I think we started estimating about 30, and then we've done more work and feel quite confident there were 42. And this was a major change in Hohokam residential patterns. Everyone lived in a compound. We've tested in between. We don't have dwellings outside the compounds that we know of, and multiple probably household groups in each compound, and a different kind of organization. People lived behind walls so that everything they did domestically was not out in the open, and we think these compounds, which held 20 plus people at times, actually helped to create a very bonded social unit that probably had farmers who worked in different parts of the basin around the Marana platform mound. So it was a time of great social change and kind of centralized issues. We didn't find grand rulers. We think it's a very egalitarian society at that time, but becoming more centralized for sure around some functions that were on behalf of the entire community. And we followed that in this short-lived community that was early classic period. And then later we worked at University Indian Ruin, which went to the end of the classic period. and perhaps a bit beyond, and involved much more diversified architecture, a much larger platform mound, and a second platform mound that had differentiated functions. So the Tucson area expression of that kind of organization was something we wanted to follow up on. And the University Indian ruin is quite densely occupied, but it had been disturbed enough. It's in the middle of a modern neighborhood, so we only had the central part of the site, and it's much more difficult to see in its entirety. But we really concentrated on a few residential areas. I think probably finishing my Ph.D., having a regular job, a position in a university, which was very satisfying because that was a context I'd been working in for some time anyway, in terms of all the research and field schools, and finally feeling that I had achieved an ability to set my own agenda along with my husband, because we did work together, and I think that's the most satisfying part of being an archaeologist, is to have a vision, lay it out, and see how far you can get on realizing that, which includes, of course, funding. And we became reasonably successful at that, at least enough to carry on all those things we wanted to do. I think with funding in archaeology, we all have to be flexible. So we had, an NSF and National Geographic. We had other kinds of grants when we worked in Brazil that are, nationally funding sources. But we also, over the course of time, and particularly when we were doing that very long survey, we sought and got and did whatever we had to do to satisfy funding from agencies, federal agencies, state agencies, private land developers, building contractors, really anything that we could approach to fund what we were doing, we did. And that was a lot of work too. I mean, that is a part of being able to pursue archaeology at all, is you simply have to keep pursuing money. I started out at ASU, and sort of by chance, because I had the opportunity to study palynology there and develop a specialty. And then I decided I wanted to broaden that kind of training, and I came to the University of Arizona and worked with Vera Markgraf, Paul Martin, different, a different range of people who I think gave me a broader, better background. I finished a master's, then we moved to Flagstaff and did a couple of stints at the Museum of Northern Arizona, and then to Georgia, where Paul got his first university position, and then back to the University of Arizona. So moving around didn't make for rapid progress. And I took a long time in my interdisciplinary PhD, but despite how administrators see that these days, I found it was really the foundation of my being who I was in the end, and being able to combine a lot of interests and pursue them at a level that I found satisfying. I think the Arid Lands Resource Sciences program itself and all its many faculty, since it's interdisciplinary, was another major influence in my career, because there were always related questions and answers, but I could see it at a very broad sort of focus. in which people in the program were working all over the world, mostly in arid lands, which is sort of where I have worked in my career. And they opened my eyes to many kinds of problems and solutions that I wouldn't see if I were more parochial. And I worked on the executive committee after I finished that directed that program for many years. And it was wonderful. For instance, my first Ph.D. student in arid lands wrote the ethnobotany of the Eastern Arabian Peninsula. And what opportunities do you get to learn a whole new area and think about it, and think about how people who live there approach it. So I think that broadness has always been very important to me. One plant kind of crystallized a lot of what I had been thinking of and working toward in Hohokam archaeology, which is looking at modified landscapes of people who were essentially agriculturalists. What did that look like? And Paul and I became very interested in all these little rock piles, these little mulches and rock piles and little terraces and little check dams that covered a huge area from the border to further north than Phoenix. And we worked with them in the survey, recording them in a very concentrated way that most archaeologists had not done previously. There was a lot of unsurety about what they represented. We worked with Charles Mixachek, who was also of a like mind, and since there was a lot of Mesoamerican experience involved, I think seeing all the agaves cultivated in Mexico made me particularly think along those lines that, maybe people here were really growing agaves in a major way, and the rock piles were the key to seeing where that was done and at what scale. And it was excavating many roasting pits that were in the fields that helped us to confirm that indeed there was roasting of agaves in these fields. And then there was a complex of tools that we could associate with collections from the fields that ethnographically and archaeologically fit agave cultivation and agave use over a broad area of Mexico and the southwestern United States. So it was this complex of evidence and this concentration on actually recording the scale at which this all occurred that brought home to us how important agave was. And so what we have been looking at that issue ever since. We started experimental plantings in 1984, more or less, and have them in 2 different places in the Tucson area. And we have come to realize that what we first considered very casual agriculture, and something that could be done in the off-season from corn, beans, and squash, is in fact such a crop, but also that these little facilities, these little mounds, developed over time and became more valuable in producing agaves as they established big root systems and began producing pups on a regular basis. So we came to know from the experimental work that they were investments of time and energy. They weren't without effort because they had to be tended by taking off the extra pups that came off the shared root system. But after 20 years or so, there was a regular progression of production that made them valuable, probably family or social unit possessions that aside from being such simple little things sitting out there on the surface, they were actually valuable, productive facilities that could be inherited and passed down. And so that was a real revelation to us. And it came from, just trying to see how they worked by doing it. I think it's inescapably true that we have diversified professionally in archaeology. There are many tracks now in the contract world, in the academic world, the museum world, working for tribal governments. There's so many options now, and I think that that's good, but I also hope those tracks don't solidify. I hope, as in my generation, archaeologists moved back and forth among those tracks, so that it was probably not typical when I was a graduate student, and right after that, although I was a graduate student forever, that people would have experiences in all of those fields and not feel that they had to identify themselves in one or another. I do think this isn't a time of expanding jobs in archaeology. It's much harder to support graduate students now. So I think there's a real pressure to make that commitment on where you're going in archaeology. And many students now have to decide if they're willing to become indebted to follow those wishes and desires and directions. I hope we cannot become locked into time tracks in graduate studies. I mean, more and more, I think there's pressure on students to do so because of the cost involved now and the fewer assistantships that are probably available. But I think the best solution for everyone is to accommodate their life aspirations, what else they want to do, who else they want to be, if they want to have families or not, who they want to work with, and to not make it a race through their professional lives. I hope we can keep some of that diversity on a personal level that makes us broader archaeologists, more thoughtful archaeologists, and allows us to think about a whole range of subjects.